Good afternoon. Now, for me, I would like to get down to more practical matters. So far we have been talking about and hearing about net zero, which is more for the long-term survivability. But then I would like to look toward the immediate future. And now, as for the time, I will set it at 20 minutes. And then Professor Chin-Soo Kim will also have enough time to present until 5:40, and then we can move on to panel discussion. Now, recently I was at the Denver IEEE meeting in July, and one of the most memorable sessions for me was about the emergency session. So it was about how they were going to regulate the wholesale market price. So the discussion followed for about 3-4 hours. And for Europe, I mean, it's a war situation, so why are we talking about a market? And let's put that aside for now, and perhaps the public sector can play the role now. So that was from the European side. But then from Faulkner, the American representative, now they were talking about we have had the history of capitalism and the power market for over 20, 30 years, so we need to continue with this, was the argument from the US side. So I was wondering why all this talk was ongoing. And I think that is because of the difference in the economic shock that they have suffered from the current situation. So, for example, in Germany, it's about 501 per 1 megawatt. But then for the futures, it's over 1001 per kilowatt. And also, more recently, I read in the papers that for the German government, they are talking about 280 trillion size for the German electricity market. But then is the market itself so large? Not really the case. I mean, it's slightly larger than Korea's. So perhaps the defense options against that are quite limited. But then now in the case of the US, so the wholesale price was about 50 billion now, $50 now it's $100, so by kilowatt it's only like 101. And then for the solar it's about like 3 cents, 5 cents, so it's about 1/3 of our price. Then also the Australian case, now their usage rate is now over 30%, and also in the US the usage rate is much higher than in Korea. So again, we see that the circumstances are quite different, but still I would say that Korea is faring well. So perhaps Europe has it worst right now, and the US and Australia are slightly better. And I would say that Japan is also suffering greatly because of the shortage of supply. So then, given the current situation, then for the power mix and the power industry and the power market, that also consider for the cost. So how are we going to make this possible? Now, this slide talks about the global energy crisis and energy policy principles, and also the starting point, especially for the global energy crisis. Somebody has summarized this very well. So when you look at the box here, then the EU's reliance on Russian gas is like 40%, much higher for coal. It's like 50%. So that is where the problem begins. So as a result, then it was first in the primary energy consumption, and then now is moving on to the power supply. So that is the beginning and end of it almost. But then what appears to be a simple problem is now having such grave consequences. So now, as you see here, now if EU were to be able to get PNG from other routes, then regardless of the crisis, they would have been able to have stable operations of the power market as well as power supply. But then again, because EU had problems with PNG with Russia, then it turned to LNG. Then the US and also the Middle East and elsewhere, the LNG prices began to skyrocket. Now, as a result of that, there were two effects. First is that it is now spilling over into an economic crisis. As was mentioned earlier, the German economy, whether it will grow or whether it will be negative, and then also for the EU, what is going to be its growth rate, and also what are the effects on the European society on the whole. So after the crisis is over, I'm sure that there would be a lot of analysis done into this. But anyway, so it is now spilling over into an economic crisis. And another is the big impact on the power side, on the electricity generation side, which takes up about 20 to 25% of the total energy usage. Right now, of course, that there has to be more analysis into the economic crisis, but I would say that right now the problem is LNG crisis. Then this LNG crisis, what is going to be the impact on the Korean economy and what does Korea have to do to address this is now going to be the main topics for my talk. So now this is going back to the basics. So the energy trilemma, which is familiar to us all. When there is an energy trilemma, then now what happens is at the top, so you try to get the cheapest energy that's possible, and then you also need to have energy security. So you need to secure the supply chain, and then also we need to have the environmental sustainability. So what we need is to strike the balance among these three. But then with the Russian situation, then as you can see on the right-hand side, now the energy security breaks down, leading to economic crisis, then leading to, as we see in Germany, increasing its coal-fired generation. So it is also detrimental to environmental sustainability. So around the time of 2020, as you see on the left-hand side, there was very close correlation among the three. So the oil price was cheap, and natural gas price was cheap, coal price was cheap, and the renewable energy supply chain was functioning well. ESS was developing, but now with the change in the situation, then affordability and security and sustainability. So we see that among these 3 points, the distance has become much longer. So perhaps, so a few years back, we were thinking that perhaps we can use LNG as the vehicle to continue with this momentum, but now we see that things have changed dramatically. And this is about the wholesale price that was also mentioned earlier. So the prices below on the left-hand side, these are US prices, which are still good. So about half of what we have here. So the Heli Hub price is like $8 or $10. So no matter how high, it is not going to be higher than this because the US also is rich in resources. So because it is a resource-rich country, you see this type of limitation in the price spike. But then in the case of Korea, not being a resource-rich country, we are faced with a more extreme phenomenon. But now, then, did we not have this type of LNG crisis before? Well, we did for every energy source, or even for the renewable energy source. And then also in the latter part of 2020, Now there was also the price spike because of the dysfunctioning of the nuclear power plant, and then also nuclear. You see that in Japan we have had this issue, and then also in France the nuclear power plants are all old, and also the cooling water shortage also became a problem. And also between Australia and China, because of the worsened relations, Australia was not able to source China's coal. And as a result, there were blackouts in some countries like India. And so from all these, what we can say for common is that if we are too concentrated on one energy source, and should there be any incidents with that source, then a problem like that one we have in the current situation can repeat itself at any time. So we need to have a more diversified portfolio, and I believe that we are on the path of creating that portfolio so that we can create a more stable path ahead for ourselves. So this is from the World Energy Council, and it talks about the Energy Trilemma Index or the Energy Security Index. I'm sure Professor Kim, you will go into this, right? So if you will, then I can be very brief about this. The Korean Energy Security Index, so based on the three elements, affordability, economics, or so affordability is about economics, and then security, environment. So based on these three elements, Korea's energy security index is not very high, the ranking. But then in terms of the energy mix, so the very subtle maintenance of the ratio 3-3-3, so renewable energy and coal or the fossil fuel and nuclear, so the 3-3-3. So then perhaps with this scheme, and now that we have the energy trilemma, perhaps that is why Korea has fared better. And now this, I believe Professor Kim will also discuss later on. And so for energy security, then I would say that this comes first, and that is about the diversity in sourcing and also the energy mix, whether we have diversified energy mix. So for example, in terms of the LNG import, we have a very good diversity. So you see that this is the type of diversity that we have, and then also long-term contract and short-term or the spot market. So it is also quite stable. And then for the nuclear power plant, so for the nuclear fuel, we have secured them for the next 2-4 years. And then for coal, of course, it also depends on the demand over the winter, but then still for about 4 months. So we will be able to tide over the winter, at least this coming winter. And just one last comment about coal and the import source. About 50% is Australia, so this is one area that we have to reconsider. And next is about the generation mix. So the US, Germany, UK, and Korea. And now this is perhaps more on an intuitive basis, but then in terms of the generation mix and also the AVO, or whether we have the surplus facilities or not, but it seems as if Korea has a more stable structure. Now, having said that, we also have so the Korean economy has a very high reliance on electricity. So if the energy security is to be undermined in any way, then the economic impact could also be quite large, perhaps as large as the one in Europe as well. Then between the generation mix and energy security, then perhaps you can find an index about the interactions between them. So among the scholars, so between the energy mix that we have and then the energy security, so we were looking at whether there are any indexes that we could see. So for example, Shannon-Wiener index, so it says that in this case, now if it is below 1, then it will be unstable, and if not, then it would be diverse and stable. And then HHI is well known to us. So these are some examples of indexes, and I believe that these are also some approaches through which we can have a more theoretic analysis. And now moving on to the security aspect. So then the question is about the capacity. So how much capacity do we have? So it would be about the capacity adequacy. So the flexibility that is mentioned in the 9th and the 10th plan, and then also the frequency or voltage. So then after all of them, then how are we going to reflect the energy security in the future energy demand and supply basic plan? So this is also another question that we have to consider for the next plan. So instead of trying to provide responses or answers, I would like to raise questions here. So first of all, what we need to think about is the capacity adequacy and also the shock index and so forth. Then also thinking about the flexibility adequacy, then how are we able to address the situation where there is shortage in a certain energy source. So we used to have that, for example, like between coal and other energy sources. But now, given that we don't have that, then we also have to make sure that we can make this possible again. Then how are we going to approach this? Meaning that how are we going to fund this? So the cost is also an important issue to consider. So the left-hand side, this is the moving average for over 20 years to calculate the volatility in the fuel price. And again, LNG price volatility really is second to none. And on the right-hand side, so for each of the exploratory variable, and when you also analyze based on them, then again, the LNG and the coal, so we see that there is, so for their prices, there are also higher correlation between the price and the production. So then for the long-term generation mix, then for the 10th or the 11th energy plan, then we also have to think about how we're going to handle these potential shocks later on. And I divided them into 3 here. So I believe that under the National Energy Plan, then we need to create something like the Energy Security Index. I'm sure that Professor Kim will go into this later on. And then for the National Power Plan, what we need to consider further is, now this is not for the 10th plan, but for the plans afterwards. And then in the National SG Plan, then the Cyber Security Index should also be included, so that the 3 national plans should also include the energy security aspect in this hierarchy. And last is about the power market. So ultimately, if we are to implement this, then we need to have better power facilities, and this is also going to be expensive. So then how can this be made possible? And also earlier there was discussion about whether the marginal costing is still valid or not. And for me, the marginal cost pricing, well, we cannot install a good nuclear power plant or anything, but then still I believe that we have to think about how can marginal costing price be valid anymore. So in the past, now with the marginal costing price, so if it is high, then we could always build another thermal power plant, meaning that we could pull up the optimal price. But then now with such stringent environmental restrictions, then I believe it merits further consideration of the marginal costing price based on SMP. And just one last comment. Now we keep talking about LMP, and now in order to have secure supply of power, then we need to have more facilities, at least double. But I believe that we need to have some kind of signal, and I would say that the signal is the LMP. So based on this signal, we can have the decision making. In the case of Korea, for the nationwide SMP, now in the past we could always build more T&D lines. So if there was regional imbalance in the power demand supply, then we could work very hard to install more T&D lines. So, and also for the thermal power plants, we could always build more. So utilizing the SMPs, so meaning we had the marginal pricing principle. But now with the changes in the environment, again, what do we have to do is the question for which we have to put our heads together to discuss. And this is just a summary of what I have explained so far, so you can refer to them. Thank you very much.